Amid escalating tensions over the Ukraine conflict, top officials from Washington and Moscow will be holding fresh talks today. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken will be speaking to his Russian counterpart. Talks between the two sides come after a heated face-off at the UN Security Council. On Monday, Moscow had sent a letter to Washington on its views about America's response to Russia's security demands. So far, no information on the contents of Moscow's response has been given out. The call will be the first time that Lavrov and Blinken will be speaking directly since the US and NATO handed over their response to Russia's demands last week. Both rejected Moscow's demands for a guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO. US President Joe Biden earlier said that the US is ready for any scenario given the ongoing buildup of the Russian troops at the border. He also said that Russia will face severe and swift consequences if it invades Ukraine.
I had a productive talk last week with President Zelensky, and we continue to engage in non-stop diplomacy and to de-escalate tensions and attempt like the devil to improve security for our allies and partners and for all of Europe, for that matter. And today in the United Nations, we've laid out the full nature of Russia's threat to Ukraine's sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine, as well as the core tenets of a rule-based international order. And we continue to urge diplomacy as the best way forward. But with Russia's continuing its buildup of its forces around Ukraine, we are ready no matter what happens.
The West claims that Russia continues to add to the 100,000 troops and a wide range of war-making equipment already in place on Ukraine's borders, including inside Moscow ally Belarus. U.S. officials say Moscow is set to invade Ukraine. Meanwhile, taking diplomatic efforts to solve the crisis forward, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson will be visiting Kiev today to hold talks with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Johnson and Zelensky will be discussing the ongoing Russian hostile activity, covering the full range of strategic UK support to Ukraine. In a statement, Boris Johnson has said that it is the right of every Ukrainian to determine how they are governed. He also said that as a friend and democratic partner, the UK will continue to uphold Ukraine's sovereignty in the face of those who seek to destroy it. Earlier, both Washington and London stepped up efforts to build pressure on Moscow. The United States and Britain are preparing new devastating sanctions against people linked to the Kremlin. American senators say that they are almost done with finalizing the deal, which will probably be put forward in the coming days. Britain says the sanctions against Russia will be the toughest ever.
This will be the toughest sanction regime against Russia we have ever had, and it is the most radical departure in approach since leaving the European Union. Those in and around the Kremlin will have nowhere to hide. We will make sure that those who share responsibility for the Kremlin's aggressive and destabilising action will share in bearing a heavy cost. Their assets in the UK will be frozen. No UK business or individual would be able to transact with them, and should they seek to enter the UK, they would be turned back.
And responding to the threat of penalties, the Russian embassy in Washington has said that Moscow will not back down in the face of US sanctions threats. With us on the broadcast this minute is our correspondent Julia Chapman, with us live from Moscow. Julia, no information so far on the contents of Moscow's response. What are you picking up at this point?
Well, Russian officials have been a bit mixed in their messaging when it comes to this response that Moscow is supposed to have offered Washington. One official from the foreign ministry said that there had been a response. Another denied that that was a specific response to the US response, as it were, to Russia's security demands. Either way, we're expecting to get a little bit more detail as to how Russia sees these responses from the West. Later today, when Secretary of State Antony Blinken holds a phone call with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. We know that in the initial reaction that Russia had to these responses, there was some doubt as to whether or not they were sufficient. We understand, although we haven't seen the content of the Western responses, that they don't address point by point all of these demands that Russia put forward. To recap what those are, Russia wants NATO to stop expanding. It doesn't want Ukraine to ever be a member of the military bloc, and it wants the organization to promise not to station offensive weapons in Eastern Europe within range of Russia. Now, many officials in the West have said that those are simply non-starters, but Secretary of State Antony Blinken last week did say that there were areas where there could be common ground. And indeed, Sergei Lavrov of Russia said that there had been some room for negotiation on what he called Russia's secondary interests. But when it came to the primary demands that I've just mentioned, he seemed to suggest that Russia wasn't satisfied with the Western response.
Right. Responding to the threat of penalties, the Russian embassy in Washington has said that Moscow will not back down in the face of U.S. sanctions threats. If you can elaborate on what the statement has said.
Well, that's right. Russian officials say that they will not be cowed by these threats of sanctions. They have accused the West of being predictable, of being anti-business when it comes to the suggestion that Russian money could be targeted in cities like London. We heard already from the UK Foreign Secretary threatening to cut off funding for sources of assets in London from those close to the Kremlin, businesses of strategic or economic importance to the Russian state. Those could be very wide-ranging if they are indeed enforced, and certainly that could be a big threat to Russia, but it says that it will not be cowed by these threats. It also does maintain, however, that it has no plans to invade Ukraine. Russian officials have been talking about an unfriendly atmosphere in Europe, which is why they say there are Russian troops on the border, but they haven't acknowledged the figure of 100,000 forces gathered there. And certainly they say they have no aggressive intent against Ukraine.
WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.